The priest's voice echoed through the silent church hall as he unfolded the last will and testament, and when he read my name as the sole beneficiary of Marcus Whitmore's $3 million estate, the woman in black who had been sobbing in the front pew stopped crying so abruptly it sounded like someone had switched off a radio. Everyone turned to stare at me sitting quietly in the back corner, the housekeeping woman they barely noticed for 15 years. And in that moment I realized that sometimes the most invisible person in the room holds all the power. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I had been standing in the doorway of Marcus Whitmore's study that Tuesday morning, dustcloth in hand, when I heard him on the phone with his lawyer. The conversation that would change everything started so ordinary, I almost didn't pay attention. I was there to clean the mahogany bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, the same ones I had been polishing every Tuesday and Friday for the past 15 years, since I started working as his housekeeper. But something in his tone made me pause, and what I heard next would haunt me for weeks. "Yes, I want to make absolutely certain," Marcus was saying, his weathered hands gripping the phone receiver with more force than necessary. "If something happens to me, Nettie Johnson gets everything, not a penny to anyone else. I don't care what anyone thinks they deserve." There was a pause, and I could hear the faint murmur of the lawyer's voice on the other end. "No, Robert, I haven't told her yet. But she's been more family to me than anyone who shares my blood, and it's time I made that official." My hands trembled as I gripped the cleaning cloth, and I stepped back from the doorway before he could see me. Marcus Whitmore, the 78-year-old widower I had been caring for since his wife Eleanor passed away 5 years ago, was leaving me his entire fortune. I had no idea how to process this information, so I did what I always did when emotions threatened to overwhelm me. I went back to work. I had started working for the Whitmores when I was 32 years old, a single mother desperately trying to make ends meet after my husband died in a construction accident. My daughter Celeste was only 8 then, and I needed a job that would allow me to be home when she got out of school. Eleanor Whitmore had been kind but distant, the sort of wealthy woman who appreciated good work but didn't form personal relationships with the help. Marcus had been different from the beginning. He would ask about Celeste's school projects, remember when she had dental appointments, and sometimes he would leave little gifts for her on the kitchen counter, books he thought she might enjoy or art supplies when she showed an interest in drawing. When Eleanor died suddenly of a heart attack, I watched Marcus transform from a social man who hosted dinner parties and charity events into someone who rarely left the house. His children, Robert and Patricia, had come for the funeral and stayed just long enough to make sure their inheritance was secure before returning to their own lives in other states. They called perhaps once a month, brief conversations where they asked about his health but never really listened to the answers. It was during those lonely months after Eleanor's death that Marcus and I developed what I can only describe as an unlikely friendship. He started asking me to stay for tea after I finished my cleaning duties. We would sit in the sunroom overlooking his meticulously maintained garden, and he would tell me stories about his childhood, his time in the Navy, the early days of building his manufacturing business from nothing. I shared stories too, about raising Celeste on my own, about my dreams of maybe going back to school someday, about the small joys that made each day worthwhile. These conversations became the highlight of both our weeks, though neither of us would have admitted it at the time. 3 years ago, something shifted in our dynamic when Marcus had a mild stroke. It wasn't serious enough to require hospitalization, but it left him unsteady on his feet, and sometimes confused about small things, like what day it was, or where he had placed his reading glasses. His children were notified, of course, but Robert lived in Seattle with his tech company job, and claimed he couldn't get away for more than a weekend. Patricia was dealing with her own divorce proceedings in Florida, and said she would visit when things settled down. Neither of them ever came. It was during Marcus's recovery that a woman named Vivian Carmichael entered our lives. She appeared at the front door one rainy Thursday afternoon, claiming to be a longtime family friend, who had just heard about Marcus's health scare. She was probably in her early 50s, with perfectly styled auburn hair and an expensive handbag that she clutched like a shield. When I answered the door, she looked right through me as if I were part of the furniture and asked to speak with Mr. Whitmore immediately. Marcus seemed genuinely pleased to see her, though I noticed he kept asking her to remind him how they knew each other. Vivian was ready with answers that sounded rehearsed. They had met at charity galas, she claimed. Her late husband had done business with Marcus years ago. She had always admired the work he did for the community. The stories were vague enough that Marcus couldn't really contradict them, especially given his recent memory issues, but specific enough that he felt comfortable welcoming her into his routine. What started as occasional visits quickly became a regular presence. Vivian began showing up 2 or 3 times a week, always with some excuse. She needed advice about investments. She was organizing a memorial service for her deceased husband and wanted Marcus's input. She was lonely and enjoyed his company. Marcus, who had been isolated for so long, seemed grateful for the attention from someone who treated him like the successful businessman he had once been rather than an invalid. To be managed, I watched this developing friendship with growing unease, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Vivian was always polite to me, but there was something calculating in the way she observed everything during her visit. She would comment on the artwork, ask casual questions about the house's history, and compliment Marcus on his taste in furnishings with the kind of specificity that suggested she was taking mental inventory. When Marcus mentioned that I had been with the family for 15 years, Vivian smiled and said something about how hard it must be to find good help these days, but her eyes never quite met mine. The first real warning sign came 6 months after Vivian started visiting regularly. I was in the kitchen preparing Marcus's lunch when I overheard them talking in the living room. Vivian was expressing concern about his living situation, suggesting that the house was too big for him to manage safely, that perhaps he should consider moving somewhere with more support services. Marcus protested that he was fine, that he had me to help with daily tasks, but Vivian's voice took on a worried tone as she painted pictures of what could happen if he fell when no one was around, if his memory issues got worse, if he needed medical attention in an emergency. "Of course Nettie does her best," Vivian said, and I could hear the careful sympathy in her voice, "but she's not trained for medical emergencies, is she? She's not family. When something serious happens, you need people who really care about your well-being, not just people who are paid to be there." I felt that comment like a physical blow. For over a decade I had been more than just Marcus's housekeeper. I had driven him to doctor's appointments when his children couldn't be bothered to call back. I had sat with him in the emergency room when he had chest pains that turned out to be indigestion. I had held his hand during Eleanor's funeral when his own children were too busy managing logistics to notice their father was falling apart. But in Vivian's carefully constructed narrative, I was just an employee, someone whose care was bought and paid for rather than freely given. Marcus defended me that day, telling Vivian that I was like family to him, that I had been there through some of his darkest moments, but I could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. Vivian had planted a seed of doubt, and I watched over the following weeks, as it slowly began to grow. She started arriving earlier for her visits, offering to help with tasks that I normally handled. She would bring groceries and insist on cooking meals for Marcus, claiming that she enjoyed taking care of people and that it reminded her of cooking for her late husband. The most insidious part of Vivian's campaign was how gradually she repositioned herself in Marcus's life. She never directly criticized me or suggested that I should be replaced. Instead, she presented herself as additional support, someone who could provide the kind of companionship and care that went beyond what any employee could offer. She started referring to herself as Marcus's closest friend, then his dear friend, and eventually in conversations I overheard, she would describe their relationship in terms that suggested something deeper than friendship. I began to notice that Marcus was becoming more dependent on Vivian's opinions. When I suggested that we call his doctor about some concerning symptoms he was experiencing, he would say he wanted to discuss it with Vivian first. When his lawyer called to schedule a routine review of his estate planning, Marcus mentioned that Vivian thought such meetings were stressful and probably unnecessary. She had a way of framing her suggestions as concerns for his well-being, while subtly undermining anyone else's input. The situation reached a turning point 8 months ago, when Marcus had another small health scare. He had been feeling dizzy and nauseous for several days, and I was worried enough to insist that we call his doctor. The appointment revealed that his blood pressure medication needed adjusting, Nothing serious, but it required a few days of monitoring to make sure the new dosage was working properly. I offered to stay overnight for those few days. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Something I had done before during his recovery from the stroke, but Vivian immediately volunteered to handle the situation instead. "Nettie has her own life to worry about," she said with that same sympathetic smile, "and this really requires someone who can be here around the clock. I don't mind staying over. After losing my own husband to health complications, I know how important it is to have someone who truly understands what's at stake." Marcus agreed to let Vivian stay, and during those 3 days, something fundamental shifted in their relationship. When I arrived for work the following Monday, Vivian was still there, making breakfast in the kitchen as if she lived in the house. She greeted me pleasantly enough, but there was a proprietary air about the way she moved through the space, opening cabinets as if she knew where everything belonged, discussing Marcus's schedule as if she had become his primary caregiver overnight. Over the following weeks, Vivian's presence became more constant and more intimate. She would arrive before I did in the mornings, and stay long after I left in the evenings. Marcus began referring to her help with his medications, his meals, his daily routine. When I tried to maintain my usual responsibilities, I would find that Vivian had already handled them, always with an apologetic explanation that she hadn't wanted to burden me with extra work. The most troubling change was in how Marcus spoke about our relationship. Where he had always treated me as a trusted friend and confidant, he began introducing me to visitors as his housekeeper, emphasizing my employee status in a way he never had before. During our tea times in the sunroom, conversations that had once been intimate exchanges between friends became more formal, with Marcus speaking to me the way an employer might speak to valued staff, appreciative, but distant. I realized that Vivian was slowly but systematically erasing me from Marcus's inner circle, replacing the emotional intimacy we had built over 15 years with her own version of care and companionship. She did it so skillfully that Marcus probably didn't even notice it happening. To him, it likely felt natural that he would grow closer to someone who was available to him constantly, someone who didn't have other obligations or responsibilities pulling her attention away. The final piece of Vivian's strategy became clear 6 months ago when she began referring to herself as Marcus's partner. Not romantically, she was always careful to clarify, but as his life partner, the person who understood his needs and preferences better than anyone else. She would say things like, "We prefer to have dinner earlier these days," or "We've decided that too many visitors can be overwhelming," with the casual assumption that she had become the primary voice in Marcus's decision-making process. When Marcus's birthday approached in October, Vivian organized a small celebration, inviting a few neighbors and some of Marcus's old business associates. I was not included in the planning, and when I asked Marcus about it, he seemed confused, as if it hadn't occurred to him that I might want to be part of the celebration. Vivian smoothly intervened, suggesting that it might be awkward for me to attend as both an employee and a guest, that it would be more comfortable for everyone if I simply helped with the setup and cleanup. I watched from the kitchen as Vivian played hostess at Marcus's birthday party, accepting compliments on the decorations I had helped arrange, serving food I had prepared, and graciously receiving thanks for organizing an event that celebrated a man I had known and cared for longer than she had. When several guests complimented Marcus on having such a devoted partner to care for him in his later years, he didn't correct them. He smiled and nodded, and I realized that in his mind, Vivian had indeed become his partner while I had been relegated back to the role of household staff. That night, after the guests had gone home and I was cleaning up the kitchen, I found myself crying for the first time in months, not just from sadness but from a deep sense of betrayal that had nothing to do with Marcus's intentions, and everything to do with how easily 15 years of genuine relationship could be rewritten by someone with the right agenda and enough patience to execute it slowly. I had spent over a decade believing that I mattered to Marcus beyond my practical usefulness, that the friendship we had built was real and valuable and irreplaceable. But watching Vivian seamlessly insert herself into his life and his affections, I began to question whether I had been naive about the nature of our relationship all along. Maybe Marcus had always seen me primarily as an employee, and the warmth between us had been nothing more than his natural kindness towards someone who served him well. It was during this period of doubt and hurt that I overheard the phone conversation that changed everything. Learning that Marcus had named me as his beneficiary despite Vivian's growing influence was both shocking and deeply validating. It meant that regardless of how others might perceive our relationship, Marcus truly did consider me family. But it also meant that I was now in possession of information that could dramatically alter the dynamics in the house, information that I had no idea how to handle. The weight of that secret became heavier over the following weeks as I watched Vivian's behavior become more possessive and presumptuous. She had started making decisions about Marcus's schedule without consulting him, canceling or rescheduling appointments, based on what she thought was best for his health. When his daughter Patricia finally called after months of silence, Vivian answered the phone and spoke to her for nearly 20 minutes before even mentioning that Marcus was available to talk. I could only hear Marcus's side of the conversation, but it was clear that Vivian had given Patricia her own interpretation of his condition and needs. The most concerning development was how Vivian had begun discussing Marcus's future as if she would naturally be part of it indefinitely. She talked about modifications that could be made to the house to make it safer for him as he aged, about healthcare decisions that might need to be made down the road, about the importance of having legal documentation that would allow her to act on his behalf if he became incapacitated. These conversations always took place when she thought I was out of earshot, but the house wasn't large enough for true privacy, and I couldn't help overhearing discussions that seemed designed to establish her legal and practical authority over Marcus's life. I found myself in an impossible position. I couldn't reveal what I knew about the will without admitting that I had been eavesdropping on a private conversation. I couldn't challenge Vivian's growing influence without seeming jealous or territorial about my own relationship with Marcus, and I couldn't protect Marcus from potential manipulation without concrete evidence that manipulation was actually taking place rather than just a series of coincidences and misunderstandings. The situation came to a head 2 weeks ago when Marcus began talking about updating his will. He mentioned it casually during one of our increasingly rare tea conversations, saying that Vivian had suggested it was important for people his age to make sure their legal affairs were in order. She had offered to help him contact his lawyer and organize his documents, and Marcus seemed grateful for her assistance with what he described as tedious but necessary business. The irony was not lost on me that Vivian was volunteering to help Marcus update the very document that would, if unchanged, leave her with nothing and me with everything. I realized that she was operating under the same assumption as everyone else, that Marcus's estate would naturally go to his children with perhaps some small bequest to acknowledge my years of service. She was positioning herself to be included in that distribution, probably as someone who had provided care and companionship during his final years. Sitting in the sunroom that afternoon, watching Marcus discuss his estate planning with such casual trust in Vivian's motives, I felt the full weight of the secret I was carrying. I was probably the only person who knew the truth about his current will, and I was certainly the only one who understood what Vivian stood to lose if Marcus died before making any changes. It was a dangerous position to be in, made more complicated by the fact that I genuinely wasn't sure whether Vivian's interest in Marcus was purely financial or whether she had developed real feelings for him that made her manipulations seem justified in her own mind. I made a decision that afternoon that I wouldn't interfere with Marcus's choices, but I also wouldn't help facilitate them. If he wanted to change his will, that was his right, but I wouldn't provide Vivian with any information or assistance that might influence those changes. I would continue doing my job, caring for Marcus to the best of my ability, and let the situation unfold according to his wishes rather than anyone else's agenda. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly everything would change, or how a routine visit to the doctor would set in motion events that would expose the truth about everyone's motivations, including my own. Marcus had been complaining of chest pains for several days, symptoms he was trying to downplay but that worried me enough to insist he see his cardiologist. Vivian agreed that he should be checked out, though she wanted to drive him to the appointment herself. I offered to come along as I had been doing for years, but Vivian suggested that too many people in the doctor's office might be confusing for Marcus and overwhelming for the medical staff. The appointment revealed that Marcus needed immediate surgery to clear a blocked artery, a serious but routine procedure that the cardiologist expected would be successful. However, the surgery required general anesthesia, and given Marcus's age and medical history, there were always risks involved. The doctor wanted to perform the procedure as soon as possible, ideally within the next day or two. It was at this point that the careful balance Vivian had been maintaining began to crumble. Faced with the possibility that Marcus might not survive the surgery, she started making decisions and assumptions that revealed just how much she had come to see herself as his next of kin. She immediately began calling family members to inform them of the situation, starting with Marcus's children but also contacting several relatives and friends as if she had been designated as his emergency contact. When Robert and Patricia both said they would try to get flights to come see their father before the surgery, Vivian took it upon herself to coordinate their visits, discussing Marcus's condition and prognosis with a level of detail and authority that seemed to surprise even them. She arranged for a private room at the hospital, organized a schedule for visitors, and began making plans for his post-surgery care as if these were decisions that naturally fell under her purview. I watched these preparations with growing alarm, not because I thought Vivian was necessarily wrong about what needed to be done, but because of how completely she had assumed control over Marcus's medical crisis. When I tried to ask Marcus directly about his preferences for visitors or care arrangements, Vivian would gently redirect the conversation, explaining that she had already discussed these issues with him and that he preferred to have her handle the logistics so he could focus on preparing for surgery. The most troubling moment came when the hospital's social worker arrived to discuss advance directives and emergency contact. Marcus had always been somewhat casual about such formal arrangements, preferring to handle things as they came up rather than planning for worst-case scenario. But now, faced with major surgery, he needed to designate someone who could make medical decisions on his behalf if he was unable to do so. Vivian immediately volunteered for this responsibility, explaining to the social worker that she had been Marcus's primary caregiver for the past year and was most familiar with his wishes and preferences regarding medical treatment. When the social worker asked about family members, Vivian mentioned that his children lived out of state and had not been closely involved in his daily care. She painted a picture of herself as the person most qualified and available to advocate for Marcus's interests. Marcus seemed overwhelmed by the legal and medical complexities being discussed, and he readily agreed to designate Vivian as his healthcare proxy. From a practical standpoint, her argument made sense. She was available, she knew his medical history, and his children had not been consistently present in his life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this designation gave Vivian a level of legal authority over Marcus that she had been methodically working toward for months. The surgery was scheduled for the following Thursday, and Marcus spent the intervening days in a state of anxious preparation that brought out both the best and worst in everyone around him. His children both managed to arrive the day before the procedure, and their brief visit revealed just how strained and distant his relationships with them had become. Robert, a thin man in his early 50s who looked perpetually worried, spent most of his time on work calls and seemed irritated by the disruption to his schedule. Patricia, who shared her father's strong jaw but none of his warmth, peppered him with questions about his finances and medical care with an efficiency that felt more like a business audit than a family reunion. Both children were polite to Vivian, but clearly surprised by her prominent role in their father's life. When Marcus introduced her as his dear friend who had been taking care of him, they exchanged glances that suggested they were wondering whether this relationship was more significant than their father was letting on. Vivian handled their curiosities skillfully, emphasizing her role as a caregiver and family friend, while subtly establishing her importance in Marcus's daily routine. I noticed that during his children's visit, Marcus seemed to retreat into a more formal version of himself, as if their presence reminded him of roles and expectations he had been allowed to forget during their absence. The easy warmth he had shown with Vivian and even with me was replaced by a careful politeness that made him seem older and more fragile. His children's obvious discomfort with the emotional aspects of his situation seemed to make everyone more aware of what was at stake. The night before the surgery, after Robert and Patricia had returned to their hotel, Marcus asked me to stay late to help him organize some personal papers he wanted to review. We sat in his study, the same room where I had overheard the phone conversation about his will, and he went through files of documents with the careful attention of someone who wasn't sure he would have another chance to review them. It was during this quiet evening together that Marcus finally acknowledged the elephant in the room. "Nettie," he said, looking up from a folder of insurance documents. "I want you to know that whatever happens with this surgery, you've been more important to me than I think I've ever properly expressed. Eleanor and I never had the kind of marriage where we talked much about feelings, and I'm afraid I carried that habit into all my other relationships. But you should know that having you in my life these past 15 years has made all the difference." I felt tears threatening and struggled to find an appropriate response. "You've been important to me too, Mr. Whitmore. You and Mrs. Eleanor gave me a chance when I desperately needed one, and you've treated me more like family than an employee." Marcus nodded slowly, then surprised me by reaching across the desk to take my hand. "I've made some legal arrangements that I think will surprise people," he said carefully. "I can't discuss the details now, but I want you to know that you don't need to worry about your future. You've earned more security than I think you realize." Before I could respond, we heard Vivian's key turning in the front door. She had started using the spare key Marcus had given her for emergencies, and her arrival interrupted what felt like it might have been a more detailed conversation about his estate planning. Marcus released my hand and returned to his papers as Vivian appeared in the doorway with a concerned expression. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," she said, though her tone suggested she expected whatever we were discussing to be concluded immediately. "I thought you might need help with your medications tonight, Marcus, and I wanted to make sure you were following the pre-surgery instructions properly." Marcus assured her that everything was under control, but I could see that the intimate mood of our conversation had been broken. I gathered up the papers we had been reviewing and excused myself for the evening, leaving Vivian to fuss over Marcus's preparations for surgery. As I drove home that night, I found myself wondering whether Marcus had been trying to tell me something specific about his will, and whether Vivian's interruption had been intentional or simply unfortunate timing. The surgery went smoothly, and Marcus recovered more quickly than anyone had expected. Within 3 days, he was alert and mobile enough to return home, though he would need several weeks of limited activity while his heart healed. Vivian had arranged for a visiting nurse to check on him daily, and she had cleared her own schedule to be available around the clock during his recovery period. I returned to my normal routine of coming to the house 3 times a week, but I found that my role had been significantly diminished during Marcus's absence. Vivian had reorganized many of the household systems, taking over responsibilities that had previously been mine, and establishing new routines that didn't require my input. When I offered to help with tasks I had always handled, Vivian would thank me politely but explain that she had already taken care of things, or that Marcus preferred to have her handle them now. The most significant change was in Marcus himself. The surgery had been successful, but the experience seemed to have aged him in ways that went beyond physical recovery. He was more cautious, more dependent on others' opinions, and more easily tired by complex decisions or emotional conversation. The man who had been fiercely independent just weeks earlier now seemed grateful to have Vivian managing the details of his daily life. It was during this recovery period that Vivian finally made her most audacious move. 3 weeks after Marcus returned home, she announced that she had been thinking about their living situation and had decided it would be best if she moved into the house permanently. She framed this decision as a practical response to Marcus's ongoing health needs, emphasizing the importance of having someone available at all times in case of emergency. Marcus agreed to this arrangement with what seemed like relief rather than enthusiasm, as if he was too tired to consider alternatives, or too grateful for her care to question her motive. Vivian moved her belongings into the guest room that adjoined Marcus's bedroom, a space that gave her immediate access to him, while maintaining the appearance of propriety that was important to both of them. With Vivian now living in the house full-time, my presence became increasingly awkward and unnecessary. She was handling the cooking, the medication management, and most of the household tasks that had previously justified my employment. When I asked Marcus directly about my schedule and responsibilities, he seemed uncertain, as if he hadn't really considered how my role might change now that Vivian was available to handle everything. It was Vivian who suggested a solution that felt like both a kindness and a dismissal. She recommended that I transition to coming just once a week to handle deep cleaning tasks that were too physically demanding for her to manage, essentially reducing my role from trusted caregiver to occasional domestic help. Marcus agreed to this arrangement, though I could see in his eyes that he understood what was happening even if he wasn't prepared to resist it. The reduction in my schedule meant that I was no longer privy to the daily rhythms of Marcus's life or the conversations that shaped his decision. I would arrive on Wednesdays to clean and do laundry, and Vivian would update me on Marcus's condition and any changes in routine, but I was no longer part of the inner circle that determined how he spent his time or what he needed. It was during one of these Wednesday visits, exactly 2 months after Marcus's surgery, that I walked into a conversation that made everything clear. I had arrived earlier than usual and used my key to enter through the kitchen, as I had been doing for 15 years. I could hear voices in the living room, and was about to announce my presence when I heard my own name being discussed. The problem is that Nettie has been here so long she probably expects some sort of bequest when the time comes. Vivian was saying in the sympathetic tone she had perfected. I'm not saying she doesn't deserve recognition for her years of service, but it would be unfortunate if family assets were tied up in obligations to household staff. Marcus's response was too quiet for me to hear clearly, but Vivian's reply was unmistakable. Of course she's been helpful, darling, but you have to think about what's best for your children and for people who will actually be part of your legacy. Nettie has her own family to worry about. She doesn't need to be a burden on your estate. I stood frozen in the kitchen, holding my cleaning supplies and listening to Vivian systematically argue for my exclusion from Marcus's will. She wasn't being cruel or obviously manipulative, just practical and persuasive, suggesting that it would be kinder to everyone involved if Marcus's estate went to people who were actually family rather than employees who might have unrealistic expectations. What made the conversation even more chilling was that I could hear Marcus agreeing with her reasoning. He was nodding along with her suggestions, asking questions about how to handle the legal aspects of changing his will, and expressing gratitude for her guidance on such a difficult topic. The man who had told his lawyer just months earlier that I deserved everything was now discussing how to minimize my expectations and protect his estate from my potential claim. I quietly left the house that day without completing my cleaning tasks, and I spent the rest of the week trying to decide what to do with the information I had accidentally gathered. I knew that Marcus had the right to change his will, that his relationship with Vivian had genuinely become important to him, and that my own feelings of betrayal didn't give me any legal standing to interfere with his decision. But I also knew that Marcus was making these changes under the influence of someone who had systematically isolated him from other relationships and perspectives. Someone whose own motivations were far from pure. I found myself wondering whether he even remembered making the original will that named me as his beneficiary, or whether Vivian's suggestions felt like obvious improvements to plans he had made during a different phase of his life. The following Wednesday, I arrived at the house to find an unfamiliar car in the driveway, and voices coming from Marcus's study. When I rang the doorbell instead of using my key, Vivian answered with a slightly flustered expression, and explained that Marcus was meeting with his lawyer to update some legal documents. She suggested that I come back later in the week when they would be finished with their business discussion. I realized that I was witnessing the execution of the plan I had overheard the previous week. Marcus was changing his will, probably removing me as beneficiary and likely including Vivian as someone who deserved recognition for her recent care and companionship. The speed with which this was happening suggested that Vivian had already done much of the groundwork, perhaps even consulting with lawyers independently to understand how such changes could be made efficient. That evening, I called Marcus's house to confirm my schedule for the following week, and Vivian answered the phone with a cheerfulness that felt forced. She explained that Marcus was feeling tired after his meeting and had gone to bed early, but that she would be happy to coordinate my cleaning schedule going forward. When I asked to speak with Marcus directly, she said she preferred not to disturb him but would have him call me back when he was feeling more energetic. Marcus never called back, and when I tried calling again several days later, Vivian answered again and explained that Marcus had been having some confusion lately, that his doctor thought it might be related to his medications but that they were monitoring the situation closely. She suggested that it might be better if I communicated through her for the time being, just to avoid overwhelming him with too many decisions or conversation. I realized that I was being systematically cut out of Marcus's life in the same way that Vivian had been systematically inserting herself into it. The process was gradual and seemingly reasonable at each step, but the cumulative effect was to isolate Marcus from anyone who might question Vivian's growing control over his affairs. I was no longer welcome to communicate with him directly, no longer trusted to handle responsibilities I had managed for years, and no longer included in decisions about his care or needs. The final blow came 2 weeks later when I received a letter from Marcus, though it was clearly written in Vivian's careful handwriting. The letter thanked me for my many years of faithful service and explained that due to changes in his health and living situation, my employment would no longer be necessary. He was grateful for everything I had done for him and Eleanor, and he hoped I would understand that this decision was based on his current needs, rather than any dissatisfaction with my work. The letter included a generous severance payment, enough to cover several months of my salary, along with a reference letter that praised my reliability and dedication. It was a professional and considerate termination, the kind that any reasonable employer might write when circumstances made a long-time employee's services unnecessary. But I knew that these words had not come from Marcus, that this decision had been made for him by someone who saw my continued presence as an obstacle to her own plan. I spent that entire weekend debating whether to fight this dismissal, whether to try to contact Marcus directly, or appeal to his children, or even consult with a lawyer about the suspicious circumstances surrounding my termination. But ultimately I realized that any action I took would look like the desperate maneuvering of a disgruntled employee who was angry about losing access to a wealthy employer's generosity. Instead, I decided to accept the severance payment and the end of my employment with as much dignity as I could manage. If Marcus had truly chosen to change his will and restructure his life around Vivian's presence, then that was his right, regardless of how I felt about the wisdom or authenticity of those choices. I would miss him terribly, and I would always wonder whether he remembered the friendship we had built over 15 years, but I wouldn't tarnish that relationship by fighting a battle I couldn't win. 3 days after I received the termination letter, everything changed in a way that no one, including me, could have anticipated. Marcus suffered a massive heart attack while working in his garden, the same garden where we had shared so many conversations over the years. Vivian found him collapsed among the rose bushes he had planted in Eleanor's memory, and despite the paramedics' best efforts, he was pronounced dead at the hospital an hour later. The news of Marcus's death hit me like a physical blow, but what followed was even more devastating. I wasn't invited to the funeral. When I called the funeral home to ask about services and visiting hours, the director politely informed me that the arrangements were being handled by the immediate family and that attendance was by invitation only. I tried calling the house, but Vivian answered and explained in her most sympathetic voice that the family had decided to keep the service small and intimate, limited to close relatives and longtime friends. I understood the message clearly. After 15 years of caring for Marcus, after being there through Eleanor's death and his health scares, after countless conversations and shared memories, I was not considered close enough to attend his funeral. Vivian had successfully rewritten the story of Marcus's final years, and in that version I was simply the housekeeper whose services were no longer required. The obituary in the local newspaper reflected this revised narrative perfectly. It mentioned Marcus's successful business career, his marriage to Eleanor, his children Robert and Patricia, and his dedication to community service. In the final paragraph, there was a brief acknowledgement of his dear friend Vivian Carmichael, who provided comfort and companionship during his final years. My name appeared nowhere in the tribute to a man I had known and cared for longer than anyone else, still in his life. I found myself grieving not just for Marcus's death, but for the erasure of our relationship from his official story. 15 years of friendship, loyalty, and genuine affection had been reduced to nothing more than a professional arrangement that had outlived its usefulness. I wondered if Marcus would have wanted this, if he would have approved of my exclusion from his final farewell, but those questions felt pointless now that he wasn't there to answer them. The day of the funeral I drove to the cemetery and parked at a distance where I could see the service without intruding. I watched as a small group of people gathered around Marcus's grave, and I could make out Vivian standing prominently near the front, dressed in elegant black and accepting condolences as if she were the grieving widow. Robert and Patricia flanked her, looking uncomfortable but resigned to her central role in the proceedings. I stayed until the service ended and the mourners began to disperse. Then I drove home and allowed myself to cry for the first time since learning of Marcus's death. I cried for losing someone who had been genuinely important to me, for the friendship that had sustained us both through difficult times, and for the bitter irony that his death had come just as I was being systematically removed from his life. Over the following days, I tried to focus on practical matters, using Marcus's generous severance payment to buy myself time to look for new employment. I updated my resume, contacted employment agencies, and began the process of finding another position that would allow me to pay my bills and maintain the modest lifestyle I had built over the years. The job search felt surreal, trying to explain to potential employers why I was suddenly available after 15 years with the same family, dancing around the complicated circumstances that had led to my termination. A week after the funeral, I received an unexpected phone call from a man who introduced himself as Robert Whitmore, Marcus's son. His voice was stiff and formal, but there was an underlying tension that suggested he was struggling with whatever he needed to discuss. He asked if we could meet in person to talk about some matters related to his father's estate, and despite my confusion about why he would want to speak with me, I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop downtown the following afternoon. Robert looked older than I remembered from his brief visit before Marcus's surgery, his face drawn with stress and exhaustion. He ordered coffee for both of us and then sat across from me in silence for several minutes, as if he wasn't sure how to begin the conversation he had requested. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "I need to ask you about your relationship with my father, specifically about any financial arrangements or expectations you might have had." I was taken aback by the directness of his question, and the implication that I might have been taking advantage of Marcus somehow. "I don't understand what you're asking," I replied carefully. "I was your father's housekeeper. I was paid a fair salary for my work, and when that arrangement ended, he provided a generous severance. I don't have any financial expectations beyond that." Robert studied my face as if he was trying to determine whether I was being truthful. "The thing is," he said slowly, "we've run into some complications with Dad's will. There are some provisions that don't match what we expected, and the lawyer is asking questions about people who might have claims against the estate." My heart began to race as I realized what he might be referring to, but I kept my expression neutral. "I wouldn't know anything about your father's will," I said. "We never discussed his estate planning, and I certainly don't have any claims against." Robert nodded, but I could see that he wasn't entirely convinced. "Vivian mentioned that you and Dad had become quite close over the years, that you might have gotten the wrong impression about your role in the family. She was concerned that you might have been led to believe you would be remembered in the will." The calculated cruelty of Vivian's strategy was breathtaking. She had not only arranged for my exclusion from Marcus's life and funeral, but she was now preemptively discrediting me, in case there were any legal complications that might threaten her own interest, by suggesting that I had inappropriate expectations, or that I might have manipulated Marcus in some way. She was laying the groundwork to challenge any provisions in his will that didn't align with her preferred outcome. "I can assure you that I never had any expectations about your father's will," I told Robert firmly. "Whatever arrangements he made were his business, and I respect his right to distribute his estate however he saw fit. If Vivian is concerned about my intentions, she needn't. I'm not interested in making any claims, or causing any problems for your family." Robert seemed relieved by my response, though I could see that he was still troubled by whatever complications had prompted this conversation. "I appreciate that," he said. "The truth is, we're dealing with some unexpected issues, and the lawyers are being very thorough about identifying potential conflicts or claims. I just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page." After Robert left, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, trying to process what had just happened. The fact that there were complications with Marcus's will suggested that perhaps he hadn't actually changed it before his death, that the document Vivian thought she had influenced might still contain provisions that surprised his family. The possibility that I might still be named as a beneficiary felt both thrilling and terrifying, given the web of deception and manipulation that had surrounded Marcus's final month. I realized that I was probably one of the few people who knew about the original will, and that this knowledge put me in a precarious position. If Marcus had died before making the changes that Vivian had encouraged, then his estate would be distributed according to the wishes he had expressed months earlier, wishes that would shock everyone who assumed they understood his intention. 3 days later, I received a formal letter requesting my presence at the reading of Marcus Whitmore's last will and testament. The letter, sent by his longtime attorney Robert Hensley, was brief and professional, stating simply that I had been named in the deceased will and that my attendance was required for the formal reading. The appointment was scheduled for the following Monday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon at the law firm's downtown offices. I spent the weekend in a state of nervous anticipation, trying to imagine what Marcus might have left me and how the other beneficiaries would react to whatever provisions he had made. I assumed it would be something modest but meaningful, perhaps a small monetary gift or a piece of jewelry that had belonged to Eleanor, something that acknowledged our friendship without causing too much disruption to his family's expectations. The law office was located in an elegant old building with marble floors and dark wood paneling that spoke of tradition and discretion. When I arrived for the appointment, I was directed to a conference room where several other people were already seated around a polished mahogany table. Robert and Patricia were there, of course, looking appropriately somber in their dark suits. Vivian sat beside them, dressed in the same understated black outfit she had worn to the funeral, her hands folded primly in her lap. There were several other people I didn't recognize, presumably distant relatives or family friends, who had been included in Marcus's will. Everyone nodded politely when I entered, but I could feel the weight of their curiosity about why the housekeeper had been invited to such a formal proceeding. I took a seat near the back of the room, trying to make myself as inconspicuous as possible. Attorney Hensley entered a few minutes later, carrying a thick folder and wearing the serious expression of someone about to deliver news that would surprise and possibly upset his audience. He was a distinguished man in his 60s who had known Marcus for decades, and I could see from his demeanor that he was prepared for a difficult conversation. "Thank you all for coming," he began, settling himself at the head of the table and opening the folder containing Marcus's will. "I know this is a difficult time for everyone who cared about Marcus, and I want to express my condolences to all of you. Marcus was not only a client, but a friend, and his death is a loss for everyone who knew him." Hensley paused to look around the room, his eyes stopping briefly on each person present. "Before I begin reading the will, I want to explain that this document was executed 18 months ago and represents Marcus's final and definitive wishes regarding the distribution of his estate. There have been no subsequent amendments or codicils, despite some preliminary discussions about potential changes that never reached completion." I felt my heart skip a beat at this revelation. Marcus had died before making the changes that Vivian had encouraged, which meant that the will about to be read would reflect his original intentions, rather than any modifications, influenced by her manipulation. I glanced around the room and saw that Robert and Patricia looked confused by this information, while Vivian's carefully composed expression showed the first crack of uncertainty I had ever seen in her facade. "The will I'm about to read is quite straightforward in its major provisions," Hensley continued, "though some of you may find certain aspects unexpected. Marcus was very specific about his wishes, and he asked me when sure that they were carried out exactly as written, regardless of any objections or challenges that might arise." The lawyer opened the will and began to read in a clear, formal voice that carried easily throughout the quiet room. The opening paragraphs were standard legal language establishing Marcus's identity and mental competency at the time the document was created. Then came the specific bequests, starting with small gifts to various charities and organizations that Marcus had supported over the years. "To my son Robert Whitmore, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my collection of naval history books, with the hope that he will remember the stories I told him about his grandfather's service during the war." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly surprised by the relatively modest nature of his inheritance. "To my daughter Patricia Whitmore, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my wife Eleanor's jewelry collection, which I hope will remind her of her mother's grace and kindness." Patricia's face had gone pale, and she exchanged a worried glance with her brother. Hensley continued reading through a series of smaller bequests to friends and distant relatives, amounts ranging from a few $1,000s to $25,000 for Marcus's favorite nephew. Each gift was thoughtful and personal, reflecting Marcus's memory of relationships and conversations that had mattered to him, but none of the amounts were large enough to account for the bulk of his substantial estate. The room had grown tense as it became clear that the major portion of Marcus's wealth had not yet been addressed. Vivian sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. I could see her calculating the remaining value of the estate and wondering where it would go if not to Marcus's children in the amounts they had expected. To Vivian Carmichael, Hensley read, and I saw her lean forward slightly in anticipation, who provided companionship during my final year. I leave the sum of $10,000 with gratitude for her friendship. The amount was generous for a relatively new friendship, but it was clearly not the significant inheritance that Vivian had been positioning herself to receive. Hensley paused and looked directly at me before continuing. The remainder of my estate, including all real property, financial assets, personal belongings, and business interests, with a current estimated value of approximately $3.2 million, I leave to Nettie Johnson, who has been more than an employee and more than a friend. She has been the daughter I never had, and the family I chose for myself. The silence that followed this announcement was deafening. I felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room, and for a moment I wondered if I had misheard or misunderstood what the lawyer had said. $3.2 million. The entire remainder of Marcus's estate, left to me, the housekeeper who had been dismissed from his life just weeks before his death. The explosion of voices that followed was immediate and overwhelming. Robert was demanding to know how this was possible, whether the will was valid, and what legal recourse they had to challenge such an obviously inappropriate distribution. Patricia was asking whether Marcus had been mentally competent when he signed this document, suggesting that he must have been manipulated or coerced into making such a drastic decision. But it was Vivian's reaction that was most telling. Instead of the shock and outrage that Marcus's children were displaying, her face showed a calculating fury that revealed just how much she had been counting on a different outcome. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she said, her carefully modulated voice finally showing its true edge. Marcus was clearly not thinking straight when he made this will. Nettie obviously took advantage of his loneliness and confusion to manipulate him into this absurd arrangement. Hensley held up his hand for silence and waited until the room quieted before responding. "I understand that this news is shocking and difficult to process," he said calmly. "However, I can assure you that Marcus was completely mentally competent when he executed this will. We spent several hours discussing his wishes, and he was very clear about his reasoning and intention. He specifically asked me to include a detailed explanation of his decision, which I will now read." The lawyer turned to a separate page and began to read Marcus's own words, written in his careful, deliberate style. "I know that my decision to leave the majority of my estate to Nettie Johnson will surprise and possibly anger some members of my family. I want to explain my reasoning so that there can be no doubt about my intentions or mental state. For 15 years, Nettie has been a constant presence in my life, providing not just professional services but genuine care, companionship, and loyalty. She was there during Eleanor's illness and death, supporting both of us through the most difficult period of our lives. She has never asked for anything beyond fair compensation for her work, never presumed upon our friendship for personal gain, and never treated me as anything other than a human being deserving of respect and kindness." The lawyer paused to look around the room again before continuing with Marcus's explanation. "In contrast, my own children have shown little interest in my life or well-being beyond their expectations of eventual inheritance. They call infrequently, visit rarely, and have made it clear through their actions that they view me primarily as an obligation rather than a person they genuinely care about. I do not leave them large inheritances because I do not believe they have earned them through love, loyalty, or sacrifice." Robert started to object, but Hensley silenced him with a look and continued reading. "I am aware that some people may view my decision as inappropriate or unfair, but I believe that family is defined by love and commitment rather than biology. Nettie has been more of a daughter to me than my biological children, and she deserves to be recognized and provided for accordingly. I hope that my biological children will use this opportunity to reflect on the relationships they have chosen to maintain and the priorities they have demonstrated throughout their adult lives." The final paragraph of Marcus's explanation was addressed directly to me. "To Nettie, I want to say that this inheritance comes with no obligations or expectations, beyond that you use it to build the secure and comfortable life you have always deserved. You have given me years of your life, and now I want to give you the freedom to live the rest of your life on your own terms. You have earned every penny of this inheritance through your kindness, your loyalty, and your genuine care, for an old man, who was lucky enough to find real family in unexpected places. When Hensley finished reading, the room was silent, except for the sound of Patricia quietly crying. I felt overwhelmed by Marcus's words, by the depth of feeling they revealed, and by the realization that he had seen and valued our relationship in ways I had never fully understood. Even as Vivian had been working to diminish my importance in his life, he had been thinking about how to ensure my future security and independence. The practical implications of what had just happened began to sink in slowly. I was now a wealthy woman, with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life, and to provide security for Celeste and any future generations of my family. The modest dreams I had harbored about maybe going back to school or traveling or simply not worrying about money had suddenly become not just possible but inevitable. But I was also now the target of what was sure to be intense scrutiny and possibly legal challenges from people who felt they deserved Marcus's money more than I did. Vivian's face had settled into a mask of cold calculation that suggested she was already planning her next move, while Robert and Patricia were clearly preparing to fight a will that contradicted everything they had assumed about their father's intention. Hensley addressed these concerns directly as he concluded the formal reading. I want to emphasize that this will was properly executed according to all legal requirements, and that Marcus's mental competency at the time of signing was thoroughly documented. Any challenges to this document will need to meet a very high standard of evidence, and I am confident that this will represents Marcus's true and final wishes. He turned to me with a slightly warmer expression. Miss Johnson, I'll need to schedule some time with you to discuss the practical aspects of managing this inheritance. There are tax implications, property transfers, and various administrative matters that will need to be handled over the coming weeks and months. I suggest we meet early next week to begin that process. As people began to file out of the conference room, I remained seated, still trying to process what had just happened. Vivian approached me as I was gathering my purse, her mask of sympathy firmly back in place despite the fury I had seen in her eyes moments earlier. I hope you understand, Nettie, that this decision is going to be very difficult for Marcus's children to accept, she said in a tone that managed to sound both concerned and threatening. They loved their father very much, and they're going to have a hard time believing that he would choose to disinherit them in favor of someone who was, ultimately, an employee. I looked at her steadily, finally seeing her clearly without the confusion and self-doubt that had clouded my judgment for so long. I understand that this is difficult for everyone, I replied, but Marcus made his own choices about his relationships and his I didn't ask for this inheritance, and I certainly didn't manipulate him into giving it to me. Vivian's smile became sharper. Of course not, she said, but you have to understand how this looks to people who don't know you as well as Marcus did. A housekeeper inheriting millions of dollars from an elderly man who had been experiencing some memory and confusion issues. It raises questions about undue influence and mental competency that might be very uncomfortable to answer in court. The threat was clear, though carefully wrapped in apparent concern for my reputation. Vivian was already laying the groundwork for a legal challenge, suggesting that I had somehow taken advantage of Marcus's vulnerability to secure an inappropriate inheritance. It was a strategy that might appeal to a jury who would find it easier to believe that a working-class woman had manipulated a wealthy man than to accept that he had genuinely valued her above his biological family. I think, I said carefully, that anyone who knew Marcus well would understand that he was perfectly capable of making his own decisions about his life and his money. He wasn't confused about what mattered to him or who had been there for him when it counted. Vivian's facade slipped just enough for me to see the cold calculation underneath. We'll see, she said simply, then turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the conference room with the weight of my new reality settling around me like an ill-fitting coat. The drive home gave me time to think about what came next. I was now wealthy beyond my wildest dreams, but I was also likely to face months or even years of legal challenges from people who felt entitled to Marcus's money. I would need to hire my own attorney, learn to manage significant financial assets, and somehow navigate the complicated emotions that came with inheriting wealth I had never expected to receive. But underneath the anxiety and uncertainty, I felt something else that surprised me with its intensity. I felt seen and valued in a way that I had never experienced before. Marcus's words read aloud in that formal setting had validated 15 years of friendship and genuine care in a way that no amount of money could match. He had recognized the love and loyalty I had given him, and he had chosen to honor that relationship in the most concrete way possible. That evening, I called Celeste to tell her what had happened. Her reaction was a mixture of shock, joy, and protective concern that reminded me why she was the most important person in my life. "Mom," she said after I had explained about the will, "this is incredible, but you need to be careful. People are going to try to take this away from you, and you need to be ready to fight for what Mr. Whitmore wanted you to have." She was right, of course. The battle was just beginning, and I would need to be stronger and smarter than I had ever been before. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was fighting from a position of strength rather than defending against erasure and manipulation. Marcus had given me more than money. He had given me proof that I mattered, that our relationship had been real, and that sometimes the people who seem powerless actually hold all the cards. The next morning brought the first wave of what would become a sustained assault on Marcus's will and my character. Patricia called early, before I had even finished my first cup of coffee, with an offer that she clearly expected me to accept gratefully. "Nettie," she said, her voice artificially warm, "Robert and I have been talking, and we want to make you an offer that we think will be fair to everyone involved. We know Dad appreciated your years of service, and we want to honor that. We're prepared to offer you $200,000 in exchange for disclaiming your interest in the rest of the estate." $200,000 was more money than I had ever imagined having, but it was less than 7% of what Marcus had actually left me. The offer revealed exactly how little Patricia understood about her father's intentions, or how determined she was to overturn them. "That's very generous," I replied carefully, "but I think I need some time to process everything that's happened and understand my options before making any decision." Patricia's tone cooled noticeably. "I hope you'll think carefully about what's best for everyone involved," she said. "Fighting this will in court is going to be expensive and unpleasant for all of us. It would be much better if we could resolve this amicably." The implication was clear: accept their lowball offer, or face a costly legal battle that would drag my name through the mud and potentially leave me with nothing. It was the same strategy that Vivian had hinted at the day before, using the threat of public scrutiny and legal fees to pressure me into accepting a fraction of what Marcus had intended me to have. After hanging up with Patricia, I called Attorney Hensley's office and scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. I needed legal representation of my own, someone who could help me understand my rights and protect Marcus's wishes from the people who were already working to undermine them. Hensley recommended a colleague who specialized in estate litigation, a sharp woman named Diana Reeves, who had a reputation for aggressive defense of disputed will. When I met with her that afternoon, she listened to my story with the focused attention of someone who had seen similar situations many times before. "The good news," she told me after I had explained about Vivian's manipulation and the family's reaction to the will, "is that Marcus's will is extremely well drafted and his competency at the time of execution is thoroughly documented. The bad news is that you're about to become the target of a very nasty campaign designed to make you look like a gold digger who took advantage of a vulnerable old man." Diana explained that will contests involving domestic employees were particularly challenging because juries often had preconceived notions about appropriate relationships between wealthy employers and working-class staff. "They're going to paint you as someone who overstepped boundaries and manipulated Marcus's affections for financial gain," she warned. "We need to be prepared to show evidence of the genuine relationship you had with him and the ways that his biological family failed to maintain meaningful connections." Over the next several days, I began to understand the magnitude of what I was facing. Vivian had hired her own attorney and was pursuing a strategy that painted me as a calculating manipulator who had isolated Marcus from his family and influenced him to change his will. She was claiming that Marcus had been experiencing cognitive decline that made him vulnerable to undue influence, and she was presenting herself as someone who had tried to protect him from my alleged manipulation. The irony was breathtaking. The woman who had actually isolated Marcus from his relationships and manipulated his perceptions was now accusing me of the very tactics she had employed. But her strategy was clever because it played into assumptions that many people would find believable. that domestic workers sometimes take advantage of elderly employers, that wealthy men can be vulnerable to manipulation by younger women, and that dramatic changes to wills often reflect coercion rather than genuine intent. Robert and Patricia joined Vivian's legal challenge, arguing that their father's decision to leave them relatively small inheritances was evidence of mental incapacity or undue influence. They painted themselves as loving children who had been unfairly disinherited in favor of an employee who had overstepped appropriate boundaries. The first few weeks of the legal battle were brutal. Diana had warned me that the opposing attorneys would try to make me look greedy and inappropriate, but I wasn't prepared for the personal attacks on my character and motivation. They obtained and publicized my financial records, showing that I had been living paycheck to paycheck for years, and suggesting that this desperation had motivated me to manipulate markets. They interviewed former employers and neighbors, looking for any evidence that I had a history of inappropriate relationships with employers, or that I had ever shown signs of being money-motivated or untrustworthy. When they couldn't find any such evidence, they simply emphasized how unusual it was for someone in my position to inherit such a substantial amount, implying that the very unusualness of the situation proved something inappropriate had occurred. The media attention was the worst part. The local newspaper picked up the story and ran it with a headline that read, "Housekeeper inherits millions from elderly employer," accompanied by a photo of Marcus's mansion and speculation about the circumstances that had led to such an unusual bequest. The article presented the basic facts neutrally, but the comments section was filled with assumptions about my character and motivations that were painful to read. People who had never met me felt free to speculate about whether I had been having an affair with Marcus, whether I had deliberately isolated him from his family, or whether I had simply been patient enough to wait for a wealthy old man to die so I could claim his fortune. The fact that I had been terminated from my position shortly before Marcus's death was presented as evidence that the family had discovered my manipulation and tried to protect him, rather than as evidence of the manipulation that had actually been taking place. Through all of this character assassination, I found strength in Marcus's own words from his will and in the memories of our genuine friendship. I knew that our relationship had been real, that his decision to leave me his estate reflected his true feelings about the people who had mattered to him, and that I had never done anything to manipulate or take advantage of him. Diana worked tirelessly to build our defense, gathering evidence of my genuine relationship with Marcus and documenting the ways that his biological family had neglected him over the years. She interviewed neighbors who had observed my faithful service over 15 years, obtained medical records that showed Marcus's mental competency right up until his death, and collected examples of the thoughtful conversations and interactions that had characterized our friendship. The breakthrough in our case came from an unexpected source. While reviewing Marcus's personal effects, Diana discovered a box of letters and cards that he had saved over the years. Many of them were from me, brief notes I had left for him when he was sick or worried about something, thank you cards for his kindness to Celeste, and holiday greetings that had accumulated over more than a decade of friendship. But more importantly, the box contained drafts of letters that Marcus had written but never sent, including several addressed to his children expressing his disappointment with their lack of involvement in his life. In one particularly revealing draft, he had written to Robert, "I have spent the last 5 years hoping that you would call more often, visit more frequently, or show some genuine interest in my well-being, rather than just my eventual death and what it might mean for your inheritance. Instead, I have watched you live your life as if I no longer exist except as a financial obligation you occasionally acknowledge." Another unsent letter to Patricia was even more direct. "You have made it clear through your actions that you view me as an inconvenience and a burden rather than a father deserving of love and attention. When you do call, our conversations are perfunctory and focused on practical matters, rather than any genuine interest in my thoughts, feelings, or experiences. I have concluded that you care more about what I might leave you than about who I am while I'm still alive." These letters provided powerful evidence that Marcus's decision to disinherit his children was based on years of observation and disappointment rather than recent manipulation or cognitive decline. They showed a man who was lucid, thoughtful, and deeply hurt by his family's neglect, someone who had made deliberate choices about how to distribute his wealth based on who had actually shown him love and loyalty. The letters also revealed Marcus's thoughts about our relationship in his own words, written privately with no intention that anyone else would ever read them. In one draft addressed to an unnamed friend, he had written, "Nettie has become the daughter I always wished I had. She listens when I speak, remembers what matters to me, and treats me with the kind of genuine affection that I haven't felt from my biological children in years. If I have learned anything in my old age, it is that family is something you build through love and commitment rather than something you inherit through genetics." When these letters were introduced as evidence, the entire tone of the legal proceedings shifted. It became much harder for the opposing side to argue that Marcus had been mentally incompetent or manipulated when his own private writings showed such clear, thoughtful reasoning about his relationships and his disappointments with his biological family. The final blow to their case came when Diana was able to prove that Vivian had been systematically lying about the duration and nature of her relationship with Marcus. Through careful investigation, we discovered that Vivian had never actually been a family friend before Marcus's stroke, that her claims about knowing him through her deceased husband were fabricated, and that she had deliberately targeted him as a wealthy, vulnerable widower who might be susceptible to her manipulation. We found evidence that Vivian had researched Marcus's background extensively before making contact, that she had practiced her story about being a longtime family friend with other people before approaching him, that she had been in significant financial difficulty at the time she began her campaign to insert herself into his life. Her motivation had been purely financial from the beginning, making her accusations against me a classic case of projection. When confronted with this evidence during her deposition, Vivian's carefully constructed persona finally cracked completely. Faced with documented proof of her lies and manipulation, she broke down and admitted that she had deliberately cultivated a relationship with Marcus in hopes of being included in his will. She claimed that she had genuinely come to care for him, but she could not explain away the evidence of her calculated approach to their relationship. With Vivian's credibility destroyed and Marcus's own words providing clear evidence of his reasoning, Robert and Patricia's attorneys advised him to settle rather than continue a fight they were almost certain to lose. The settlement negotiations were tense and bitter, but they eventually agreed to accept their father's original bequests without further challenge in exchange for my agreement not to pursue legal fees and damages against them for their frivolous contest. 8 months after Marcus's death, I finally took possession of the inheritance he had intended me to have. The money was life-changing, but more important was the validation of our relationship and the recognition that Marcus had valued our friendship exactly as much as I had believed he did. I used part of the inheritance to establish a scholarship fund in Marcus's name for students like Celeste who needed financial assistance to pursue higher education. I bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood where I could garden and read and live without worrying about money for the first time in my adult life. And I kept the box of letters that Marcus had written but never sent, proof that sometimes the most important relationships in our lives are the ones that grow quietly, without fanfare or public recognition, but with the deep roots that sustain us through everything. The morning after the settlement was finalized, I woke up in my old apartment for the last time. The cardboard boxes stacked in every corner contained 15 years of modest possessions, but they also held the weight of a completely transformed future. As I made coffee in the tiny kitchen where I had counted pennies and worried about bills for so long, I felt the strange displacement of someone whose entire world had shifted overnight while the physical space remained exactly the same. Celeste arrived early to help with the final packing, her excitement barely contained as she surveyed the boxes that represented our escape from financial uncertainty. She had taken time off from her job at the hospital to help me move, and I could see in her face the same mixture of disbelief and gratitude that I had been carrying for months. We had both spent so many years accepting that security was something other people had, that financial stability was a luxury we couldn't afford to dream about. "Mom," she said, carefully wrapping one of Eleanor's teacups that Marcus had given me years ago, "I still can't believe this is real. Every morning I wake up thinking I'm going to discover it was all some elaborate dream." I understood exactly what she meant. The transition from poverty to wealth had happened so quickly that my mind hadn't caught up with my new reality. I still found myself checking prices at the grocery store, still felt guilty about spending money on anything that wasn't absolutely necessary, still woke up in the middle of the night worrying about bills that I no longer had to pay. The house I had purchased was a modest two-story colonial in a neighborhood that represented everything I had ever wanted but never dared to hope for. It had a small garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers, a reading nook by the front window where I could watch the seasons change, and enough space for Celeste to visit comfortably whenever she wanted to stay over. After years of cramped apartments and shared walls, the prospect of having my own quiet space felt almost decadent. But the most profound change wasn't in my living situation or my bank account. It was in the way I moved through the world, no longer apologetic about taking up space or asking for what I needed. For the first time in my adult life, I had the luxury of making choices based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford, and that freedom was more intoxicating than any amount of money in the bank. The legal battle had changed me in ways I was still discovering. Defending myself against Vivian's accusations and the family's challenges had forced me to articulate the value of my relationship with Marcus, to stand up for the legitimacy of our friendship, and to refuse to be diminished by people who saw me as nothing more than an opportunistic employee. I had learned that I was stronger than I had ever imagined, more resilient than I had given myself credit for, and more deserving of respect than I had previously demanded. Moving day itself was surprisingly emotional. As the professional movers loaded my furniture into their truck, I found myself saying goodbye not just to the apartment, but to the version of myself who had lived there. The woman who had scraped together rent money and worried about unexpected expenses, who had made her decisions based on survival rather than choice, who had accepted other people's assessments of her worth because she didn't have the resources to challenge them. The first few weeks in the new house were an adjustment period that revealed how deeply poverty had shaped my thinking and behavior. I would walk through rooms that were larger than my entire previous apartment, and feel like I was trespassing in someone else's life. I would open kitchen cabinets stocked with food I had bought without checking the prices, and feel a flutter of anxiety about the expense, even though I now had more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. Celeste helped me navigate these psychological adjustments with the gentle patience she had inherited from her father. She would remind me that the money was mine, that Marcus had wanted me to use it to build a comfortable life, and that feeling guilty about having enough was just another form of the scarcity thinking that had kept me small for so long. Gradually I began to relax into my new circumstances, to make decisions based on preference rather than necessity, and to enjoy the simple pleasure of not worrying about money. The garden became my sanctuary during this transition period. I spent hours planning flower beds and vegetable plots, researching which plants would thrive in my new backyard's particular combination of sun and shade. The physical work of digging and planting and weeding gave me a way to process the emotional complexity of my changed circumstances, while creating something beautiful and productive with my own hands. It was while I was working in the garden one afternoon, in late spring, that I received an unexpected visitor. The doorbell rang just as I was transplanting tomato seedlings, and when I answered the door with dirt still under my fingernails, I found Robert Whitmore standing on my front porch. He looked older and more tired than he had during the legal proceedings, his expensive suit somehow making him appear smaller rather than more impressive. "Hello, Nettie," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I was in the neighborhood, and thought we might be able to talk for a few minutes." I invited him in, more out of curiosity than courtesy, and offered him coffee while I washed the garden soil from my hand. We sat in my new living room, surrounded by furniture that Marcus's inheritance had made possible, and I waited for him to explain why he had come. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened," he said finally, staring into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions he was struggling to articulate. "About Dad, about the will, about the things he wrote in those letters that came out during the trial. I wanted to apologize for some of the accusations we made against you. They were unfair, and based on assumptions rather than facts." His apology surprised me, though I could see that it was costing him considerable effort to admit he had been wrong. "I appreciate that," I replied carefully. "It was a difficult time for everyone involved." Robert nodded, then looked around the room with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This is a nice place," he said. "Dad would have approved. He always liked houses with character and gardens where you could grow things." The mention of Marcus created a moment of shared sadness, that reminded me that Robert had lost his father, regardless of how complicated their relationship had been. "He used to talk about you sometimes," I said gently, "about things you did when you were younger, places you went together. He was proud of your success, even if he didn't always know how to express it." Robert's eyes filled with tears that he tried to blink away quickly. "I know I wasn't a very good son, especially these last few years. I kept thinking there would be more time, that eventually I would figure out how to have the kind of relationship with him that he deserved. I let work and distance and my own discomfort with emotions get in the way of staying connected." I could see that Robert was carrying guilt about his father's death, and regret about opportunities missed. The will contest had forced him to confront the reality of his relationship with Marcus, to see documented evidence of his father's disappointment and loneliness, and to realize that his inheritance expectations had been based on obligation rather than genuine connection. "He understood that adult children have complicated lives," I said, though I wasn't sure this was entirely true. "I think what hurt him most was feeling like he didn't matter to you anymore, like he was just someone you called occasionally out of duty, rather than someone you actually wanted to talk to." Robert was quiet for a long time, processing this assessment of his relationship with his father. "Vivian was right about one thing," he said eventually. "You did become more important to him than his biological children, but that wasn't because you manipulated him or took advantage of him, it was because you showed up. You were there when he needed someone, and we weren't." This admission seemed to drain something out of Robert, leaving him looking exhausted and defeated. I realized that losing the will contest had been devastating not just financially, but emotionally, forcing him to confront the ways he had failed as a son, and the reality that his father had found the family connection he needed with someone else. "I don't think Marcus stopped loving you and Patricia," I said honestly, "but I think he needed to feel loved in return, and that wasn't something you were able to give him in the way he needed it." Robert nodded slowly. "I came here today because I wanted you to know that I understand now why Dad made the decision he did. I don't like it, and it's going to take me a long time to adjust to the financial reality, but I understand. You earned what he left you through years of caring about him as a person rather than as a bank account." After Robert left, I sat in my garden and thought about the strange journey that had brought me to this point. A year ago, I had been a housekeeper worried about keeping my job and paying my bills. Now I was a wealthy woman living in my own house, with enough money to last for generations, and the knowledge that someone had valued me enough to entrust me with his entire life's work. But the inheritance had given me more than financial security. It had validated my worth as a human being, confirmed that the love and care I had given Marcus had been real and valuable, and proven that sometimes the most important relationships in our lives develop quietly, without recognition or fanfare, but with deep roots that sustain us through everything. The legal battle had also taught me things about myself that I might never have discovered otherwise. I had learned that I was capable of standing up to intimidation and character assassination, that I could fight for what was right even when the odds seemed overwhelming, and that I deserved to be treated with respect regardless of my economic status or social position. Diana Reeves, my attorney, had become a friend during the months we worked together, and she helped me understand that my victory was significant beyond my personal circumstances. "Cases like yours set precedents," she explained during one of our final meetings. "When domestic workers successfully defend their right to inherit from employers who valued them, it establishes legal protection for other people in similar situations. Your courage in fighting this contest may help other women who find themselves in comparable positions." I hadn't thought about my case in those terms, but I realized that Diana was right. Vivian's accusations had been based on assumptions about appropriate relationships between employers and domestic workers, assumptions that reflected broader social prejudices about class and worthiness. By refusing to accept a settlement that would have validated those assumptions, I had helped establish that genuine relationships could develop across economic lines and that those relationships deserved legal protection. The scholarship fund I had established in Marcus's name became my primary focus as I settled into my new life. Working with the local community college to identify deserving students reminded me daily of how transformative educational opportunities could be for people who had been written off by others, or who had never been given chances to prove their potential. The first recipient of the Marcus Whitmore Memorial Scholarship was a young woman named Sandra, whose circumstances reminded me strongly of my own situation decades earlier. She was a single mother working multiple part-time jobs while trying to complete her nursing degree, and the scholarship eliminated the financial pressure that had been forcing her to choose between her education and her immediate survival needs. When I presented Sandra with the scholarship check at a small ceremony at the college, she cried in a way that reminded me of my own tears when Marcus had helped me navigate various crises over the years. "This changes everything," she told me, clutching the check as if it might disappear if she loosened her grip. "I was going to have to drop out next semester because I couldn't afford to keep going, but now I can finish my degree and build the kind of life I want for my daughter." Watching Sandra's reaction made me understand more deeply what Marcus had given me through his inheritance. It wasn't just money, though the financial security was life-changing. It was the gift of possibilities, the freedom to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford, and the knowledge that someone had believed in my potential enough to invest in my future. The anniversary of Marcus's death approached with a mixture of sadness and gratitude that had become familiar over the months since his passing. I missed our conversations terribly, missed his dry sense of humor and his thoughtful observations about the world around us, missed the simple comfort of knowing that someone genuinely cared about my well-being and looked forward to my visit. On the morning of the anniversary, I drove to the cemetery for the first time since his funeral. His grave was in a quiet section shaded by mature oak trees, marked by a simple granite headstone that reflected his preference for understated elegance over ostentation. Someone had left fresh flowers recently, probably Patricia or Robert, making their own private pilgrimage to acknowledge their father's death and their complicated feelings about their relationship with him. I had brought flowers too, a mixed bouquet from my own garden that included some of the same varieties he had grown in his backyard. As I arranged them beside the headstone, I found myself talking to Marcus as if he were there to listen, telling him about the house and the garden and the scholarship recipients who were benefiting from his generosity. "I hope you know that I'm using the money the way you wanted me to," I said quietly, feeling slightly self-conscious about talking to a grave, but needing to express thoughts that had been building for months. "I'm not being foolish with it, but I'm not being so careful that I forget to actually live either. I think you would approve of the choices I make." The peaceful setting and the simple act of acknowledging Marcus's ongoing importance in my life brought a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. The legal battle had been about defending his wishes and my right to inherit, but it had also been a distraction from the more fundamental work of grieving someone who had been genuinely important to me. Sitting beside his grave, I realized that the inheritance was just one part of what Marcus had given me over the years. He had also given me respect, friendship, and the experience of being valued for who I was rather than what I could do for others. Those gifts had shaped me long before I knew about the will, and they would continue to influence how I moved through the world regardless of how much money I had in the bank. The drive home took me past the house where I had worked for 15 years, the place where Marcus and I had developed our unlikely friendship and where Vivian had orchestrated her campaign to replace me in his affection. The new owners had painted the exterior and made some changes to the landscaping, but it was still recognizably the place where so much of my adult life had unfolded. I slowed down as I passed the house, not out of nostalgia but out of a kind of amazement at how different my life looked now compared to a year ago. The woman who had driven up this same street every Tuesday and Friday worried about keeping her job and making her rent, had been transformed into someone with choices and resources and the confidence to use both. That evening, Celeste came over for dinner, as she did every Sunday, and we sat in my new dining room, eating food I had prepared without worrying about the cost of the ingredients. She was dating someone new, a pediatrician she had met at the hospital, and I could see in her face the happiness that came from not having to worry about whether her romantic choices were financially practical. "You know what I love most about your inheritance," she said as we were cleaning up the dishes. "It's not just the money, though obviously that's incredible. It's seeing you make decisions based on what you want instead of what you have to do. You've spent your whole adult life putting everyone else's needs first, and now you finally get to think about what would make you happy." Celeste was right, though I was still learning how to prioritize my own preferences after decades of making survival-based decisions. The luxury of choice was something I was still adjusting to, still learning to embrace without guilt or apology. The following week brought an invitation that surprised me and forced me to confront how much my social position had changed along with my financial status. The invitation was to a charity gala sponsored by several prominent local families, including some who had been friends of Marcus and Eleanor during their marriage. A year ago I would have been serving at such an event, not attending as a guest, but my inheritance had apparently qualified me for inclusion in the city's philanthropic circle. I almost declined the invitation, intimidated by the prospect of socializing with people who had previously been completely outside my social sphere. But Diana encouraged me to attend, pointing out that my participation in charitable giving was part of my responsibility as someone with significant wealth, and that I needed to become comfortable navigating the social expectations that came with my new economic status. The gala was held at the city's most elegant hotel, in a ballroom decorated with flowers that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. I wore a simple black dress that Celeste had helped me choose, nothing too flashy but appropriate for the formal setting, and I tried to project confidence I didn't entirely feel as I entered a room full of people who seemed to know exactly how to behave in such circumstance. The evening was a series of small conversations with people who were curious about the housekeeper who inherited millions, but polite enough to approach the topic indirectly. I found myself telling the story of my relationship with Marcus over and over, emphasizing the genuine friendship we had developed and the ways he had become like family to me over the years. Some people were genuinely interested in understanding how such an unusual relationship had developed, while others seemed more focused on the gossip value of my story. I learned to distinguish between sincere curiosity and prurient interest, and I developed responses that satisfied people's questions without revealing more personal details than I was comfortable sharing. The most meaningful conversation of the evening was with Eleanor's sister Margaret, a woman in her 70s who had known Marcus for decades, and who had watched from a distance as his relationship with his children deteriorated over the years. She sought me out specifically to tell me how pleased she was that Marcus had found companionship and genuine care during his final years. Eleanor would have approved of his decision, she told me quietly as we stood near the silent auction table. She always worried about what would happen to Marcus after she was gone, whether he would become isolated and lonely. She would have been grateful to know that someone was taking care of him the way you did. Margaret's words meant more to me than any legal victory or financial windfall could have, because they represented acceptance from someone who had known Marcus in the context of his marriage and his earlier life. Her approval suggested that my relationship with Marcus had been appropriate and valuable not just in my own assessment, but in the judgment of someone who had loved him long before I met him. As the evening progressed, I began to relax into conversations about philanthropic giving and community involvement, topics that were new to me but fascinating in their complexity. I learned about different approaches to charitable work, about the challenges of ensuring donated money was used effectively, and about the social expectations that came with wealth in a community like ours. By the end of the evening, I had committed to serving on the board of a local literacy program, and had made tentative plans to collaborate with several other donors on educational initiatives that aligned with my interests. The transition from recipient of charity to provider of charitable giving felt symbolic of how completely my life had changed, but it also felt like a natural progression of the values that Marcus had modeled during our friendship. Driving home from the gala, I reflected on how the evening had challenged my assumptions about wealthy people and charitable giving. I had expected to feel out of place and unwelcome, but instead I had found a community of people who were genuinely committed to using their resources to address social problems and support people who needed assistance. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now in a position to help other women in situations similar to my own former circumstances. The scholarship fund was just the beginning of what I could do with Marcus's inheritance, and I began to envision other ways to support people who were struggling with the same challenges I had faced for so many years. As summer turned to fall, I settled into routines that reflected my new life while honoring the values that had sustained me through more difficult times. I volunteered at the community college where the scholarship recipients were studying, helping other adult learners navigate the challenges of returning to school while managing work and family responsibilities. The volunteer work reminded me weekly of how transformative educational opportunities could be for people who had been dismissed or overlooked by others. I saw myself in many of the students I worked with, people who were smart and capable but who had never been given chances to prove their potential or who had been forced to delay their dreams because of economic circumstances. Working with these students also helped me process my own transformation from someone who worried about basic survival to someone with the resources to help others achieve their goal. The continuity between my former struggles and my current ability to address similar struggles in other people's lives gave meaning to the dramatic changes I had experienced. My relationship with Celeste deepened during this period as we both adjusted to our changed circumstance. She was finishing her nursing degree and planning to specialize in pediatric care, and we could discuss her future plans without the underlying anxiety about money that had colored so many of our previous conversations about her education and career goals. "I keep thinking about how different our conversations are now," she told me one evening as we were planning her graduation celebration. "For so many years, every decision I made had to be filtered through the question of whether we could afford it. Now we can actually talk about what I want to do with my life without constantly worrying about the financial implications." Celeste's observation captured something important about how poverty had shaped both of our thinking for so long. The constant pressure of financial insecurity had forced us to make decisions based on survival rather than aspiration, and the removal of that pressure had freed us to imagine possibilities that had previously been beyond our reach. The first Christmas in my new house was both joyful and bittersweet, marked by abundance I had never experienced but shadowed by Marcus's absence from a holiday he had always enjoyed. I decorated the house with care, hanging lights and arranging garlands with the same attention to detail I had once brought to preparing Marcus and Eleanor's home for their holiday celebration. Celeste and her boyfriend joined me for Christmas dinner along with several neighbors I had gotten to know over the months since moving into the neighborhood. The table was set with china I had been able to afford for the first time in my life, and the meal included dishes I had prepared without calculating the cost of ingredients or worrying about whether I was being too extravagant. During dinner, I found myself thinking about Marcus and wondering what he would have made of the gathering in his honor. He had always enjoyed meeting new people and hearing their stories, and I thought he would have approved of the mix of generations and backgrounds represented around my table. As the evening wound down and my guests prepared to leave, Celeste pulled me aside for a private conversation that had clearly been on her mind for some time. "Mom," she said, "I've been thinking about something, and I want to ask you about it before I make any decision. Josh has been talking about proposing, and I want to make sure you know that when I get married, it won't change how important you are to me or how much I appreciate everything you've done for me." I could see that Celeste was worried about how her changing life might affect our relationship, concerned that marriage might somehow diminish the close bond we had maintained through all the challenges of the past year. Her concern touched me deeply and reminded me of how much our relationship had been shaped by the knowledge that we only had each other to rely on. "Sweetheart," I said, hugging her tightly, "the best thing about having enough money now is that I don't need you to take care of me anymore. You can make decisions about love and marriage based on what will make you happy rather than what feels safe or responsible. That's what I want for you." Celeste cried a little as she processed this assurance, and I realized that she had been carrying concerns about my welfare that were no longer necessary, but that had become habits formed during years when my financial stability had depended partly on her help and support. As the new year began, I reflected on the profound changes that had transformed my life over the past 18 months. The journey from worried housekeeper to secure inheritor had been challenging in ways I never could have anticipated, but it had also revealed strengths and possibilities I hadn't known I possessed. The legal battle had forced me to articulate my worth and defend my right to Marcus's generosity, but the more important battle had been internal, learning to accept that I deserved the security and opportunities his inheritance had provided. After decades of making do with less, of accepting other people's assessments of my limitations, I was finally learning to embrace abundance without guilt and to make choices based on preference rather than necessity. Marcus's inheritance had given me more than money. It had given me proof that love and loyalty were valuable, that genuine relationships could transcend social and economic boundaries, and that sometimes the most important family connections were the ones we chose rather than the ones we inherit. The knowledge that someone had valued me enough to entrust me with his life's work had transformed not just my bank account, but my understanding of my own worth and potential. Standing in my garden on a cold January morning, planning the flowers I would plant when spring returned, I felt grateful not just for the material security Marcus had provided, but for the example he had set of treating people with dignity regardless of their social status. His friendship had taught me that I deserved respect and consideration, Lessons that had sustained me through the legal challenges and that continued to influence how I navigated my new life. The woman who had worried about keeping her job and paying her bills had been replaced by someone with choices and resources, and the confidence to use both generously. But the values that had made me worthy of Marcus's trust, the loyalty and genuine care that had characterized our friendship, remained unchanged. If anything, my new circumstances had given me more opportunities to practice those values, to extend to others the kind of support and encouragement that had meant so much to me during my years of struggle. As I planned the year ahead, choosing which charitable causes to support and which educational initiatives to fund, I carried with me the knowledge that every dollar I spent honored not just Marcus's memory but the relationship we had built together. His inheritance had given me the power to transform other people's lives, the way mine had been transformed, and that responsibility felt both daunting and deeply meaningful. The scholarship recipients who would benefit from my giving, the students I worked with at the community college, the neighbors who had welcomed me into their community, they were all part of the continuing story that Marcus had made possible. His decision to trust me with his wealth had created ripples that would extend far beyond my own life, touching people he had never met but who would benefit from the values he had lived by and the friendship he had treasured. In quiet moments, I still missed our conversations, and his gentle humor, still felt the absence of someone who had genuinely cared about my thoughts and experience. But I also felt his presence in every generous choice I made, every opportunity I created for someone else, every time I chose to see potential where others saw limitation. The inheritance he had given me was more than money. It was a legacy of believing in people who deserved better than they had received, and I intended to honor that legacy for the rest of my life. The spring of my second year in the new house brought unexpected complications that tested my growing confidence in ways I hadn't anticipated. A phone call from an investigative journalist named David Chen changed everything when he explained that Vivian Carmichael had been running similar schemes with other elderly men across multiple states, and my case might be crucial to establishing a pattern that could help protect future victims. "I've been tracking Miss Carmichael's activities for months," David explained during our initial conversation. "Your situation with Marcus Whitmore isn't isolated. There have been at least 3 other cases where she's used identical tactics to position herself for financial gain from vulnerable widowers." This revelation was both shocking and validating. Learning that Vivian's manipulation of Marcus had been part of a calculated pattern rather than an isolated incident helped me understand that the campaign against me hadn't been personal but professional. She had seen Marcus as a mark, someone whose wealth and vulnerability made him an ideal target for the kind of long-term con she had apparently perfected over years of practice. David's research had uncovered documentation of Vivian's previous relationships with elderly men, including court records from a will contest in another state where she had successfully obtained a significant bequest from a man she had known for less than 2 years. In that case, there had been no one to challenge her claims, and the man's distant relatives had settled rather than fight an expensive legal battle. The journalist's investigation revealed that Vivian had been using multiple identities and had a network of accomplices who helped her research potential targets and create convincing cover stories about her background. The level of sophistication involved in her operations was staggering, suggesting that she had been running this type of con for much longer than anyone had realized. David asked if I would be willing to go on record about my experiences with Vivian and the tactics she had used to manipulate Marcus. He explained that my testimony could be crucial to helping authorities build cases against her for fraud and elder abuse, and that speaking publicly might encourage other victims or their families to come forward. The decision to participate in David's investigation was difficult because it meant reliving the painful period when I had watched Vivian systematically erase me from Marcus's life. But I realized that staying silent would allow her to continue victimizing other vulnerable people, and that Marcus would have wanted me to help protect others from the kind of manipulation he had experienced. The article that resulted from David's investigation was published in a major newspaper and quickly picked up by other media outlets across the country. The story detailed Vivian's pattern of targeting elderly men, described the sophisticated methods she used to gain their trust and isolate them from other relationships, and included my account of how she had manipulated Marcus and attempted to prevent him from maintaining his friendship with me. The media attention was intense but ultimately positive, with most coverage focusing on the broader issue of elder fraud rather than the sensational aspects of my inheritance. The article positioned me as someone who had courageously fought back against a predatory scheme, rather than as a housekeeper who had somehow manipulated her way into a fortune. The publication of the story had immediate consequences for Vivian. Within days of the article's appearance, authorities in 3 different states announced investigations into her activities, and several other families came forward with similar stories about her attempts to insert herself into their elderly relatives' lives. More importantly for me, the article definitively cleared my name of any suggestion that I had manipulated Marcus or taken advantage of his vulnerability. The evidence David had gathered showed conclusively that Vivian had been the predator in the situation, and that my relationship with Marcus had been exactly what I had claimed it was, a genuine friendship built over years of mutual respect and affection. The vindication felt profound, not just because it cleared my reputation but because it confirmed that my understanding of my relationship with Marcus had been accurate all along. The legal victory had established my right to his inheritance, but the journalistic investigation had validated the emotional truth of our friendship and the sincerity of his decision to include me in his will. The story also brought me into contact with other people who had experienced similar situation, including adult children whose elderly parents had been targeted by con artists and caregivers who had been falsely accused of manipulation when they were actually the ones protecting their employers from predatory behavior. One of the most meaningful connections I made during this period was with a woman named Helen Morrison, whose father had fallen victim to a scheme very similar to Vivian. Helen reached out to me after reading the article, and her story was heartbreakingly familiar. A sophisticated con artist had isolated her father from his family, convinced him that his children didn't care about him, and positioned herself to inherit his estate. Helen's father had died before she could gather enough evidence to challenge the will, and the woman who had manipulated him had inherited nearly $2 million. The legal fees involved in fighting the inheritance would have been enormous, and Helen's siblings had decided it wasn't worth the financial risk or emotional trauma of a prolonged court battle. Talking with Helen and other people who had experienced similar situations helped me understand how fortunate I had been to have the evidence necessary to defend Marcus's original intention. Many families faced with suspicious circumstances around a loved one's will simply didn't have the resources or documentation needed to mount an effective challenge. This realization inspired me to expand my charitable giving beyond education to include legal assistance for families dealing with suspected elder fraud. I established a fund that provided grants to cover legal fees for people who needed help investigating or challenging suspicious changes to elderly relatives' wills, but couldn't afford the cost of litigation. The fund was modest at first, but it grew as word spread about its availability and as other donors who had read about my case contributed to support its mission. Within 6 months, we had helped dozens of families investigate suspicious circumstances around their relatives' estates, and in several cases, we had uncovered evidence of manipulation that led to successful legal challenges. Working on these cases gave me a new understanding of how common elder fraud actually was and how devastating it could be for families who lost not just their inheritance, but their confidence in their own perceptions of their relationships with elderly relatives. Many of the families I worked with had been gaslighted in the same way I had been, told that their concerns about predatory caregivers or sudden changes in their relatives' behavior were really jealousy about money or resentment about being replaced in their loved one's affection. As my involvement in elder advocacy grew, I was invited to speak at conferences and workshops about my experiences and about the warning signs that families should watch for when elderly relatives suddenly change their social circles or financial arrangements. These speaking engagements were initially terrifying for someone who had spent most of her life avoiding public attention, but I found that sharing my story helped other people understand the complexity of elder fraud and the importance of taking suspicious changes seriously. The speaking engagements also helped me process my own experiences and understand them in a broader context. Telling my story repeatedly forced me to articulate not just what had happened but why it mattered, and how the tactics Vivian had used reflected broader social attitudes about aging, vulnerability, and the relationships between people of different economic class. One of the most powerful speaking engagements was at a conference for adult protective services workers, people whose job it was to investigate suspected abuse or exploitation of elderly adults. Many of these workers had never encountered cases like mine where the target of manipulation had been wealthy and apparently well cared for, and they were surprised to learn how sophisticated financial predators could be. My involvement in elder advocacy also brought me into contact with researchers studying the psychology of financial predators and their victims. I participated in several studies examining how con artists selected their targets, how they built trust and dependency, and how they isolated victims from other relationships that might provide protection or alternative perspective. The research revealed that people like Marcus were particularly vulnerable not just because of their wealth but because of specific psychological factors related to aging and isolation. Widowed men were especially susceptible to manipulation by women who offered companionship and care, particularly if their relationships with their adult children were strained or distant. Understanding the psychological dynamics involved in Marcus's manipulation helped me forgive him for the ways he had been influenced by Vivian's campaign against him. I realized that her tactics had been specifically designed to exploit normal human needs for connection and care, and that even intelligent, successful people could fall victim to such sophisticated manipulation. As the second anniversary of Marcus's death approached, I reflected on how dramatically my understanding of his final years had evolved. Initially, I had seen his relationship with Vivian as a betrayal of our friendship, evidence that I had been easily replaced by someone who offered him something I couldn't provide. But learning about the sophisticated nature of her manipulation helped me understand that Marcus had been a victim rather than a willing participant in my exclusion from his life. The anniversary also marked 2 years since I had inherited his estate, and I wanted to commemorate the occasion by doing something that would honor both his memory and the values he had tried to live. After considerable thought, I decided to establish a residential facility for elderly people who were at risk of financial exploitation, a place where they could live safely while maintaining their independence and autonomy. The facility would provide not just housing but education about financial scams, legal assistance for people who had been targeted by predators, and social programs designed to reduce the isolation that made elderly people vulnerable to manipulation. It would be a place where people like Marcus could age with dignity while having access to the support and protection they needed. Planning the facility required months of research into regulations, staffing requirements, and architectural considerations, but it also gave me a concrete way to channel the energy and resources Marcus had entrusted to me. The project felt like a natural extension of our friendship, addressing the very vulnerability that had made him susceptible to Vivian's manipulation. The groundbreaking ceremony for the Marcus Whitmore Center for Elder Protection was held on a sunny morning in October, exactly 2 years after Marcus's death. The ceremony was attended by dozens of people whose lives had been touched by elder fraud, including Helen Morrison and several other families I had worked with through the Legal Assistance Fund. Celeste spoke at the ceremony about how Marcus's generosity had transformed not just my life, but the lives of everyone who would benefit from the programs and services the center would provide. Her words captured something important about how individual acts of kindness and recognition could create ripple effects that extended far beyond the original relationship. The ceremony also included remarks from David Chen, the journalist whose investigation had exposed Vivian's predatory behavior, and from several attorneys who had worked on elder fraud cases. Their presence emphasized that the center represented more than just my personal tribute to Marcus. It was part of a broader movement to protect vulnerable adults from financial exploitation. As I stood at the podium to deliver my own remarks, I thought about how far I had traveled from the woman who had been afraid to challenge Vivian's manipulation or assert my own worth in Marcus's life. The confidence I had gained through fighting for his intentions had enabled me to become an advocate for other people facing similar challenges. The months following the groundbreaking were filled with the detailed work of transforming architectural plans into a functioning facility. I worked closely with architects, contractors, and social service professionals to create a space that would feel like home rather than an institution, a place where residents could maintain their privacy and independence while having access to protection and support. The first residents moved into the Marcus Whitmore Center in the spring, 3 years after Marcus's death and exactly 1 year after I had first conceived of the project. Watching elderly people settle into their new apartments and begin forming friendships with other residents felt like the completion of a circle that had begun with my own friendship with Mark. Among the first residents was a woman named Dorothy Chen, the elderly mother of the journalist who had investigated Vivian's crimes. Dorothy had been living alone in a large house where she had become increasingly isolated and vulnerable to telephone scams and door-to-door sales tactics. Her son had been worried about her safety but reluctant to pressure her into moving to a traditional assisted living facility. The center also became a resource for adult children who were concerned about elderly parents, but didn't know how to address potential signs of exploitation without seeming controlling or paranoid. We offered family education programs that taught people how to have difficult conversations about financial safety and how to recognize the difference between normal aging and cognitive changes that might create vulnerability. The success of the center attracted attention from other communities that wanted to replicate our model, and I found myself consulting on similar projects across the country. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying, providing concrete evidence that Marcus's inheritance was creating exactly the kind of positive impact he would have wanted. As the center celebrated its first anniversary, I reflected on how much my understanding of family loyalty and worthiness had evolved since the day I overheard Marcus telling his lawyer that he wanted to leave me his entire estate. The journey from that moment of shock to this celebration of community and protection had taught me lessons about resilience, justice, and the power of genuine relationships that I could never have learned any other way. The legal battle had established my right to Marcus's inheritance, but the work of honoring his intentions had required me to think beyond my own financial security to consider how wealth could be used to address the very problems that had made our friendship necessary in the first place. Marcus had needed genuine care and companionship because his biological family had failed to provide it. Now I was working to ensure that other elderly people would have access to authentic community and protection. Celeste had graduated from nursing school and was working in pediatric care, but she volunteered at the center regularly and had developed particularly close relationships with several of the residents. Her involvement in the center's activities reflected her understanding that the inheritance had created opportunities not just for financial security but for service and connection. As I prepared for bed that night in the house that Marcus's generosity had made possible, I felt a deep sense of gratitude not just for the material security I now enjoyed, but for the opportunity to live a life of purpose and impact. The scared housekeeper who had hidden in the kitchen while Vivian planned my exclusion from Marcus's life had been replaced by someone with the confidence and resources to protect other vulnerable people from similar exploitation. The transformation hadn't been easy or automatic. It had required me to learn new skills, challenge my own assumptions about my limitations, and find the courage to speak publicly about experiences that were deeply personal and sometimes painful to revisit. But each step of the journey had revealed strengths and possibilities I hadn't known I possessed. Marcus's friendship had taught me that I was worthy of love and respect regardless of my economic status or social position. His inheritance had given me the resources to act on that knowledge, to build a life that reflected my values rather than just my survival needs. And the work I was doing to honor his intentions had connected me to a community of people who shared my commitment to protecting and empowering vulnerable adults. Looking toward the future, I could see years of meaningful work ahead, expanding the center's programs, supporting other communities that wanted to develop similar facilities, and continuing to advocate for stronger protections against elder fraud. The resources Marcus had entrusted to me would allow me to pursue this work without worrying about my own financial security, and the relationships I had built through the center would sustain me through whatever challenges lay ahead. The woman who had once worried about keeping her job and paying her bills had discovered that she was capable of much more than she had ever imagined. But the values that had made me worthy of Marcus's trust, the loyalty and genuine care that had characterized our friendship, remained the foundation of everything I was working to build. In honoring his memory and intentions, I had found my own voice and purpose, and that discovery had been worth more than any amount of money he could have left me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.